What is up, YouTube? I'm Devon DaVinci, leader of the Renaissance Crew, and you're watching DaVinci Reacts. Today we're going to be getting into a video that was created by History Scope. I will have a link for their channel at the end of this video, so the last 30 seconds you'll see an icon pop up. You can click on it and it will take you to their channel. You can watch their video, subscribe, like, all the other good stuff. And this video is about the Nuremberg trial. So this is the trial that happened after World War II, I believe, where they were trying a lot of Nazis for the Holocaust specifically, but I'm pretty sure it also covered other war crimes too. I don't know a lot about the trial itself. I'm just aware of it. This, of course, is not including the Nazis that were eventually brought over to America to help with different scientific things. I believe that was called Operation Paperclip, something like that. The reason why I'm getting into this is because I did a reaction video to the movie Downfall. Now, for those of you that don't know about Downfall, there is a very specific scene that I'm sure you are aware of that's been memed to hell and back. So if you're familiar with it, then and you want to give it a look, come over to my Patreon channel where I do all my movie reactions. You will see the DaVinci Watch version of that reaction there. If you want to watch along, then there are certain things that you will need, preferably a VPN that'll allow you to watch videos in any country, because a lot of times these videos I do react to are videos that are region locked. So Downfall in particular, it's available in the United States if you rent it off of Amazon Prime Video, and it's also available on the Australian Netflix. So if you want to watch it on Netflix, you'll have to use the Australian, you'll have to be on an Australian server and have a Netflix account. But with that being said, let's jump into this and see what it has to offer. By the way, Patreon stuff is in the description box down below. Well, let's check this out.
The Nuremberg trials saw the end of a regime that caused the Holocaust, and it was the first time in history where an international court sentenced people to prison and to death. It would later set the stage for an International Court of Justice, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and 2 Geneva Conventions. Germany started the Second World War when it invaded Poland, and eventually attacked over half a dozen countries throughout the continent. But by 1943 the tide of war had turned. The Soviet Union was beginning to push back at Leningrad, Moscow, and Stalingrad, while the British meanwhile had beaten back the German air raids and pushed the Axis powers out of Africa. So the leaders of the major Allied powers came together to discuss the state of the world after World War II had ended. Stalin of the Soviet Union, Roosevelt of the USA, and Churchill of the United Kingdom discussed creating the United Nations, the D-Day invasions, and dividing Germany up into 4 occupation zones. Because Germany will be divided. But that was not all. Over the course of World War II, it became apparent that Germany committed atrocities on a massive scale. The night raids, the forced deportations, the mass genocide. There was only one question on everybody's mind. How do you punish acts that are this evil? To this question, there were basically only 3 answers. The first was to do nothing. To let all the atrocities, all the death, all the destruction go unpunished. But how could any country consent to such a course of action? How could the far-off USA, the invaded Soviet Union, or the occupied Czechoslovakia consent to such a course of action?
All I can guess is the reason they probably didn't want to, why that was even an option, is because they know that by doing that, it puts their own atrocities in question, or prevents them from doing anything that could be seen as an atrocity in the future. Because I know for a fact, America, we've done some stuff that other countries would see as war crimes and atrocities. So it makes them nervous to do certain things. But now I think America's a little bit more bolder with some of this stuff because of how powerful we are as a nation. There's a lot of people that think we can just get away with it. And that's, at the risk of getting my video or my channel caught on some type of watch list, there's going to be some some retribution with America and some of these atrocities. I mean, you can already kind of see it with how we're dealing with the Middle East right now. Like, a lot of that conflict is stuff that stems from us overstepping our boundaries and not really caring about what the people themselves want. Now, of course, I don't think it's on the level of like the Holocaust or anything like that, but there are some things that are answers for things we've done.
The second option was to put all the perpetrators to death through executive action, to simply give the command to kill thousands of people, regardless of whether they committed any war crimes or not. But this action was disliked by both Roosevelt and Churchill at the time.
Yeah.
And so eventually...
I had a feeling Stalin probably didn't have a problem with that option.
action was disliked by both Roosevelt and Churchill at the time. And so eventually, by the end of the war, a third option was chosen. Justice through persecution. It was decided that the perpetrators of the Second World War and of the Holocaust would be dealt a fairness and justice that they themselves destroyed in Germany. But that brought up the next question. How do you punish someone from another sovereign country for crimes that are not actually illegal in that country? The Allied powers answered this question with the London Charter of the International Military Tribunal. This charter laid out a system where 4 different legal codes of France, the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom would be incorporated into a single tribunal. There were prosecutors and defense attorneys according to British and US laws, but decisions and sentences were imposed by a group of judges according to French and Soviet legislation.
Something tell me this isn't going to help the whole stereotype about the Russian judge being tough. I have a feeling the Russian judge is probably going to be stereotypically, they're going to be the Russian judge.
Furthermore, 4 types of crimes were determined that a person could be indicted for. The first is crimes against peace, which included planning, initiating, and waging wars of aggression or wars in violation of international treaties. The second is crimes against humanity, such as extermination, deportation, and genocide. The third is war crimes. This basically meant a violation of the rules of war that were set before the Second World War, such as executing prisoners. The fourth crime is a common plan or conspiracy to commit any of the 3 aforementioned crimes. After all, simply because you didn't put anyone in the gas chambers yourself doesn't mean you're not guilty of creating the system leading to such genocide. It would be possible for someone to be indicted for any or all of these crimes. For example, Wilhelm Keitel, who was the de facto head of the German military during the war, was indicted for all 4 crimes. He was found guilty on all 4 charges at the Nuremberg trial and sentenced to death. Or take the case of Julius Streicher, publisher of an anti-Semitic newspaper. He was only indicted for conspiracy and crimes against humanity, and he would only be found guilty of the latter, although he too would be sentenced to death for that crime. It is important to note that this is not the only trial. There were several others, such as the doctor's trial and the judge's trial. The Nuremberg trial, however, was only for the worst offenders. Those who had created the system of oppression and extermination in Germany and its occupying territories. One of such worst offenders is Wilhelm Frick, Minister of the Interior and co-author of anti-Semitic laws imposed in Germany before the war. Or Ernst Kaltenbrunner, the highest-ranking SS officer tried at Nuremberg and chief of the intelligence, Gestapo and criminal police. Both of them would be found guilty and both of them would be sentenced to death. In total, 24 men would be indicted at the trial. Of these 24, there are 3 special cases we need to discuss first. First is Martin Bormann, who was party secretary. He was absent at the trial. He would be found guilty and sentenced to death in absentia. However, it would be discovered in 1972 that he had actually died a few days before the war had ended, but his body wasn't identified before then. There's also the case of Gustav von Bolen und Halbach, a major industrialist. He was found medically unfit for trial and passed away in 1950 without sentencing. And thirdly is the case of Robert Ley, head of the German trade unions.
Look at that forehead.
He believed that, as the loser in the war, he ought to just be shot, rather than to be brought before a tribunal like a criminal.
He got an 8
Ley
head.
therefore strangled himself in his cell 3 days after receiving his indictment. The trial was now almost ready to begin. The war was over, the men had been captured, and the crimes were determined. But there was one more obstacle to overcome before the trial could commence, and that was the problem of language. This trial was held between French, English, Russian and German speakers. How were they going to communicate efficiently with each other? IBM came up with a brilliant system that we still use today: simultaneous interpretation. This is the technique where interpreters translate what is being said while it is being said, and then everybody can listen to the translation in their own native language directly via headphones. This is how, for example, the United Nations and the European Parliament work today. Now it was time for the trial to commence. Each of the 4 countries provided a prosecutor and a team of experts behind them. The defendants were entitled to receive a copy of the indictment made against them, any relevant explanation about the indictments, and to be represented by a lawyer of their choice. And of course, the defendants chose the best German lawyers they could possibly find. To give an example of how good these lawyers are, let's look at the case of Admiral Karl Dernitz, head of the German Navy from 1943 onward. He was indicted because he had ordered his submarines not to help the survivors of any sinking ship, instead letting them drown in the Atlantic Ocean. This was in clear violation of the Second London Naval Treaty. His lawyer, however, would save his life. He presented evidence that the USA had committed the exact same breach of the treaty in the Pacific in its war with Japan, and argued that Dernitz should not be convicted for a crime the USA also committed. And it worked. Karl Dernitz was sentenced to only 10 years in prison. He was released in 1956 and died in 1980. When the trial first started, prosecution was afraid there wouldn't be any evidence that these men were responsible for the atrocities committed during the war. But they forgot the German character. The Germans documented everything. 47 crates of binders, 1400 kilograms of party records, and kilometers of film poured in. Therefore, the prosecution decided not to go directly after the greater atrocities of World War II. Instead, they wanted to lay bare the system of conspiracy that would slowly lead to the Second World War and the atrocities committed in them. They wanted to prove that it was these men who created the system that would lead to these atrocities. From the supposed need for breathing room to feed the German people, to the aspiration of the extermination of what they considered an undesirable population. The prosecution pulled out one incriminating document after another, such as a document that showed how they were planning to start a war by whatever means necessary. It is my unalterable decision to squash Czechoslovakia by military means in the near future. It is the job of the political leaders to bring about the military and politically suitable moment. The primary defense of these actions was that they were only made illegal after the crimes had been committed. But the prosecution countered by stating that the first person to be sentenced for murder could just as easily have argued that nobody had ever been sentenced for murder, so why should they? They argued that some crimes are so universally immoral that it shouldn't require a precedent. One of the defendants, Albert Speer, realized that the prosecution, the Allied powers, and the judges wanted to hear an apology.
I remember seeing a specific video talking about him. It was called the Nazi that apologized or something. I didn't watch it, so I don't know exactly what it was about, but his name sounded familiar.
An admission of wrongdoing, an expression of repentance, and so he simply gave them one. He took personal responsibility for the crimes he and his country had committed. While Speer was responsible for ordering the use of hundreds of thousands of slave laborers, he himself was only sentenced to 20 years in prison. He was released in 1966 and died in 1981. Now that the prosecution had presented that there was indeed a common conspiracy against peace and certain types of people, they continued with the greater atrocities of the war. They showed a documentary about the concentration camps, which I will not show here because I do not want any of my audience to involuntarily see the horrific acts depicted in them. If you do want to see the evidence, it is available on the English Wikipedia page on the Nuremberg trials, and I will leave a link in the description. This film showed the horrors of the concentration camps, the piles of bodies, the gas chambers, the unimaginable suffering. People in the courtroom cried. Some even fainted. The defense of these men on trial could largely be summed up as, "I was just following orders." The prosecution deconstructed that argument, stating that men who commit crimes cannot plea as a defense that they committed them in uniform. Military men are not above and beyond the moral requirements that apply to others, incapable of exercising moral judgment on their own. They pointed out that another German general, Erwin Rommel, had been ordered to kill any commandos that he had or would capture, but Rommel had burned the order, showing that even a high-ranking general was able to exercise moral judgment and disobey immoral orders. As the trial progressed, a very curious case became clear, that of Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht was a prominent banker and economist in Germany, having served as president of the central bank and economics minister. While an important figure before the war, he had lost all his power by the time it started, and had even been in contact with resistance leaders until he himself was put in a concentration camp. In the end, he was acquitted and set free, and would go on advising developing countries on matters of finance and economics, and passed away in 1970. By now, all the evidence had been presented, and the accused had been given the opportunity to defend themselves. It was now time to pass judgment. It took the judges 2 days to determine the sentences of these 24 men. 12 were sentenced to death by hanging, 7 were sent to prison, 3 were acquitted, and 2 were left without a decision. Of those men sentenced to death who have not yet been named in this video are Hans Frank, Governor General of occupied Poland; Alfred Jodl, a general in the German military who signed the summary execution of the Allied commandos and Soviet commissars; Joachim von Ribbentrop, ambassador to the UK and later Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was responsible for a treaty that divided Poland up between Germany and the Soviet Union; Alfred Rosenberg, Minister of Eastern Occupied Territories; Fritz Sauckel, head of the slave labor program; Arthur Seyss-Inquart, commander of the occupied Netherlands; and Hermann Göring. We'll come back to him in a little bit. The men sentenced to prison who have not yet been named.
He was a special kind of
Walter
asshole,
Funk,
apparently.
Minister of Economics, and sentenced to life imprisonment, but released due to ill health in 1957 and passed away in 1960. Konstantin von Neurath, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Reich Protector of Bohemia and Moravia, and resigned in 1943, sentenced to 15 years in prison, but released in 1954 due to ill health, and passed away in 1956. Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the German Navy until his retirement in 1943, sentenced to life imprisonment, but released in 1955 due to ill health, and passed away in 1960. Baldur von Schirach, head of the party's youth division until 1940, sentenced to 20 years in prison and passed away in 1974. And Rudolf Hess. We'll also get back to him later. Out of the 3 men who were acquitted, there was the previously named Schacht, but also Hans Fritzsche, a popular radio commentator and head of the news division of the propaganda ministry. His crimes were not deemed severe enough for this tribunal, and he would later be sentenced to 9 years in prison at a different trial. He would be released in 1950 due to ill health, and died in 1953. And there is Franz von Papen. He served as the Chancellor and Vice-Chancellor of Germany, was an ambassador to Austria and later Turkey. He was acquitted at Nuremberg. However, he would later be sentenced to 8 years in prison for his actions during the war. He appealed that decision and was once again acquitted after serving only 2 years in prison, and passed away in 1969. The hangings of those sentenced to death would take place 2 weeks later. Hermann Göring, the highest ranking man on trial, took one last act of defiance by committing suicide. He was commander of the Air Force, de facto head of the economy, and the original head of the Gestapo. He was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to death. The hangings were supposed to be done via the standard drop method, where the goal is to break the neck so the person dies instantly instead of suffering a slow strangulation. But some of the hangings were botched and took several minutes of strangulation before they died. Von Ribbentrop took 17 minutes to die, Jodl 18, and Keidel 28. The bodies were then cremated and the ashes dumped into the river. The last one of these men to die was Rudolf Hess. He flew to Scotland in 1941 to negotiate a peace treaty with the British, but was instead imprisoned. Thus, he didn't participate in many of the atrocities. He was sentenced to life imprisonment and died in 1987 when he strangled himself at the age of 93. The prison was demolished to prevent it from becoming a shrine to followers of that toxic ideology, but instead his burial site became a destination for yearly pilgrimages by neo-Nazis. So when the lease on his burial site ended in 2011, his grave was reopened, his remains cremated, and his ashes scattered at the sea.
They should have kept the grave there, but then put like booby traps around it. So every year when they have a pilgrimage, just like have the shit detonate. I know it's dark. See, I've said this comment before. This is why I'm not president. This is why I don't run for politics, because I have methods that some would consider to be unnatural.
And so ended the regime that started the Second World War in Europe, committed genocide with a brutality rarely seen in history, and took the lives of 50 to 56 million people. This video was only a summary of the Nuremberg trials. I had to leave out many things, such as the fact that the Soviet Union committed many of the same atrocities, but were not put on trial, or why Nuremberg was chosen as the location. Therefore, if you're interested in reading more about the topic,
I could have sworn I heard that the Nuremberg was chosen as the destination because that was the name of either the name or the place that the Holocaust, the architect of the Holocaust was from. Like, that's where they planned the Holocaust, or that's where it originally started. Something like that.
I will provide a few sources down below where you can learn more about the subject. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up and press the subscribe button. My next video will finish the series on the Tulip Mania, and after that I will start a new series on the Aztec Empire. If you want to see those and other videos as soon as they come out, press the subscribe button.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to check out more of this. The Tokyo trial in particular, because again, that was another one with war criminals and people getting tried for atrocities. I'm guessing it's the Japanese war crimes in World War II as well. World War II is an interesting topic because it's like, I pinpoint World War II as when the old way of empires governing and fighting and expanding and things like that ended, and the modern system that we live under was created. Like, what Hitler did was, and what the Japanese did, were the same and akin to what Napoleon tried to do, what Genghis Khan did, the Alexander the Great, all of them. Like, they kind of did the same thing. I don't know if they necessarily did the same atrocity. Well, I'm sure Genghis Khan did, but I don't know about Alexander the Great. And, well, it is interesting. While Napoleon was a dictator, I don't really hear too many stories about the atrocities he did, because usually with dictators comes some type of atrocities. So I'd have to look more into, like, him. But, yeah, what they did, Hitler isn't necessarily too different from them. But nowadays, ever since World War II, like, we've kind of put a stop to that. Like, you don't really see countries just expanding and just taking over territory around them. Now it's much more like a diplomatic world. And if a country were to expand, it would be through some type of diplomatic means, like the people voting to leave some old country and join a different country or something like that. So it's like the world was changed with World War II. Maybe it was because of how connected we were as a world. Like, you have different forms of media that's able to cover things that wasn't covered in the past. So you can, like, see firsthand and hear firsthand what this type of imperialistic warfare could do. And it opened a lot of the everyday person's eyes to, like, okay, well, this is way too damn much. We have to change this. But yeah, it is interesting. Let me know what you all think about it in the comment section down below. I've been on this kick of watching, like, a bunch of videos dedicated to historical events, in particular World War II. I mean, it's not a shocker. Everybody studies World War II at some point. It's probably the most popular historical topic that reactors can react to. But yeah, I've just been getting deeper and deeper into it. But with that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and share. I'm going to go back and look up a lot of the stuff that they talked about in this and go watch a bunch of stuff. Like that video about the Holocaust is interesting as well. At some point, I would like to, if I ever had the money to do it, I would like to just go around the world and just like visit the locations where all these historical events happened, like to go to Auschwitz and the concentration camps and just see firsthand what, went down, to go and visit the birthplace of legendary historical figures, to go and see the trenches of World War One, and to go and see the like all the prominent locations in Asia and Africa and South America and things. Like if I had the money, I would like to do a world tour, because you only live once, and all the stuff that's happened in this world, like I would like to be able to experience, or at least to be able to say that I was there at the same place that these people were at. And it's like you just get a piece of history each place you go to. But yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and wrap this up. I hope you've been enlightened. Again, you can check out the original source for what is it, History Scope? You can check out History Scope's channel at the end of this video. It should be popping up soon if you want to check out more of their stuff. And the original link is in the description box down below. So if you want to do a reaction to it yourself, if you are a reactor, or if you just want to watch the video without me pausing and stopping and things like that, or you want to watch the original video because you haven't seen it yet, because you always should watch it before you watch the reaction. That's the link that you will use. Now, I'm signing out, so I look forward to seeing you guys in a future video, and until then, I'm giving you the deuces. Peace.